In this video, we're going to continue our dive into the Glowcraft controller, looking closer at show modes. So we're going to go back to our panel here, and we are going to log into the controller. Once again, remember that is a Wi-Fi connection. Your password is currentLA, all lowercase, and you're going to log in on a web browser at 4.3.2.1. Once you do that, you're going to choose Installers, click in, and it'll come right to your home page here. And we're going to jump right over to our Shows tab. So this is how you're going to go about creating show modes or animations and things like that. So if you're familiar with the Blue Ghost controller, typically there's already presets for most everything. So if you go in your turn signals, your brakes, anything like that, you have somewhat limited options. It's still a lot more than any other controller out there, but they are preset. So if you were to have an idea yourself of a startup animation or a turn signal style or a brake or some other thing like that, you are limited to what is pre-programmed into that controller. Whereas with the Glowcraft controller, you don't have any presets, but you're able to create your own designs and change things up as you like. So just keep in mind that this is a bit of an advanced controller, so it will require a good bit of playing to try to figure out how to accomplish what it is that you're trying to do with the lights. So the first thing you want to do is in the top right corner, click Add, and it's going to open up the Show Mode Creator page. And in here, the first thing you want to do is set a name. And I'm just going to go Show 1. And you pretty much name that whatever you want. If you're doing a turn signal, a DRL, or something like that, you would probably want to name it that way so it's easier to find it. So just keep that in mind. I'll call it Show 1. Next, you're going to have your priority. So the priority determines if there are multiple show modes being activated by triggers or other things within the controller, it will determine which one to play in what order. So if you have, in the case of brake lights or turn signals or things like that, you have a hierarchy system as well within the Blue Ghost controller, and you can kind of follow along that same idea. Typically the turn signals should be your top priority, and then you would have your brakes below that, reverse probably a little bit below that, and then your DRL is usually one of your last priority displays, being that brakes, turn signals, reverse, all that stuff should play over top of the DRLs in the event that they are all actually activated at that time. So priority is definitely something you're going to want to play with a little bit and just kind of think about the aspects of the show mode and what the purpose of it is. You might even have cases where you create a show mode, but you want another show mode to play over top of it in the event that a trigger is activated or something like that. That's where you can get really creative, but that is what the priority aspect is for, is figuring out at what order different show modes that you create will play. Next, you have the demoable checkbox. Now, the demoable checkbox is basically in the UI app. So on the customer level, let's say you're designing these sets of lights, programming them, everything, so you can ship it out to a customer, and they're going to have the application for the phone. So they're going to download that application. Well, you can preset several show modes on that application by checking this box. So you can create a couple show modes and you can check that box, and it will become an option to them in the app, as well as if you choose the user side of this versus the installer side on the web browser application. So it's a good way for you to add a few features or extra options to customers that might get a set of lights from you, so they can actually activate show modes. But it also enables you to hide show modes if you don't want them to have access to those. So if you have turn signals, DRLs, or something like that, and for some reason those you don't want to be activated through the app, but rather only activated on your side, or via signals or triggers or things like that, you can do that just by leaving that box unchecked. It can also help to declutter that page that's going to populate when they pull up the app a little bit. So if you imagine having your turn signals, your DRLs, and you have to turn signal functions for each side of the car, so left turn, right turn, your brakes, your reverse, all that extra fluff in there can just create a little bit of confusion. It's not really necessary. So think about that when you're choosing whether or not you want to create a show mode to be dimmable. Up next on this side, you have your triggers. And now this is where you can get really fancy and choose when and when not to activate a mode. Typically, what you're going to do is you're going to determine that input 1 is your DRL, input 2 is turn signal 1, input 3 turn signal 2, and so on. Figuring up of the 8 signals, how many are you going to use and what each one of them is going to do. So with this, you can choose active, inactive, or frequency. So you can basically set it so that it does it when it's active, so when there's 12 volts to it. It only does it when it's inactive, so that means there's no signal going to it. You can choose frequency, which basically means if it's like a turn signal where it's pulsing, it turns on, off, on, off, on, off. That's a typical function of a turn signal on a car. You can go in there and you can choose to say that if it's doing that, that it will continue to work. And there's a setting on the settings page that will actually adjust the timing for that frequency, but by default you're good for a turn signal. But if you've got a car that's on duty cycle or something like that, you might have to use that function as well. But that is a option for that, so that way it has a little bit more of a time delay between the light turning on and off, that 12 volt signal that's coming into the controller. You also have the option to limit it to all or any, so you can basically say that if all of these parameters are met, it will activate, or you can say if any one of these parameters are met, it will activate that show mode. So once again, like extreme amount of customization here that you can do, just deciding which scenarios you want to activate different modes, and it's really going to create a lot of options for different builds and different aspects and different applications. Definitely will be interesting to see what people do with those options over the years. And just like the include, you just see down there, you also have the exclude, and it's basically just, you know, do you want to exclude these triggers, include these triggers? Does this trigger have to be off? Does this one have to be on? That's going to take a lot of playing to fully understand just the scope of how much you can work and play with all those triggers. But they're all there to have fun with. And once again, in most circumstances, you're either going to choose active or frequency and probably only one input, and that will activate whatever show mode you're creating, your DRL, your brake, whatever it may be. Up next, you have your panel drop-down box. Now, this will populate with all the panels that you created in this application. So, in the case of this controller, I only have one. In the case of the S2000 Tails, I had 3. But you can create multiple panels. I don't even know if there's a limit to the amount of panels you can create, and they will all populate in here. And the cool thing about that is if you have multiple panels, you can actually make each panel do something completely different while this show mode is active. So if you had a big round panel, you could put a little Schernigan spinning in there, and then you can have these doing RGB flowy stuff on the outside tail lights. So, you know, and the idea of if you think of like a third brake light, 2 tail lights, or you know, some of them have the little brake light down in the bottom corner for like reverse light, things like, you know. So if you got multiple lights on a car, rear, front, or, you know, multiple aspects to that, if you're trying to use this controller to run an entire car, you know, you may not want the front headlights to be doing the same thing as the back headlights, and that's where this will come in. You can set each panel to do the same thing. You do have to manually do that. You'll have to go in and assign those exact same parameters. They don't have a copy function yet to go across multiple panels. That might be something really cool to add in the future, but as of right now, you do have to set each panel up individually to do the different things that they do. But that drop-down box will populate all the panels that you have created so that you can set on this show mode what happens on each panel separately. Next to that, you have the clear frame box, and that just basically means that it will clear the panel out. So in the event that anything else is playing, it will clear everything out between each frame. If you don't choose that, then you can get a little bit of like a ghosting effect, and that might be desired, might be something you want for a certain mode. So you can play with that on, off. I'm 90% of the time, 99% of the time probably, going to use clear frame. But it is there if you do want to add that little ghosting effect or some kind of a, you know, other trick that it might do for whatever purpose you're using it for. Up next, you have loop. Now, loop is basically just going to make it continue to play in a loop. So if you create a show mode and you just want it to keep playing, and when it gets to the end, it starts back at the beginning and plays through again, loop is what you're going to want to select. So in a case of like a brake light or a DRL, you would not want to loop it. You probably want it to go a solid color when it's done. But if you were doing a turn signal, well, you're definitely going to want that to loop if it's an animated turn signal, because otherwise it's just going to play that animation and stop. So loop is going to vary. Show modes, I think most show modes you're probably going to want to loop it, because otherwise it's just going to look like it froze. So just keep that in mind. That's what loop will do. It just starts back at the beginning when it's finished playing through the animation. And then you have layer. I believe I got this one right, but layer is actually for the grid itself, for your panel. So you can create multiple layers on a panel, but you can also create multiple layers down here. So I don't know that you necessarily need both, because you can kind of do both using this. But I'm sure there are circumstances, maybe the timing, if you want timing to not match up perfectly, you could probably use multiple layers for that purpose. Whereas with the timeline down here, if you add multiple layers, they're going to be synced time-wise on the same timeline. So that is an option there if you wanted to have multiple layers within each panel. And the last step is the seconds. That sets the time frame of your timeline for this show mode. So how long will it play before it ends and then starts back over, if assuming you chose loop. So moving down to the actual timeline. Now for the timeline, you do have add layer. So if you're going to be stacking show modes, you can choose the add layer function. You have the X, which will delete a layer in the event that you need to do that. You have the up and down arrows, which will move a layer up or down if you need to. You know, just think the layer on the top is the layer in front, and the layer below that would be the layer behind. So let's say you create a layer and you want to flip them so that this one becomes up front. You can just move it with using those arrows to reorient that layer to be in front of the other layers or behind, whatever your goal is with that layer. The plus is where you're going to actually add the layer itself. Now, by default, it comes up as null, which means there's just no show mode selected. You can change your time, and they are cut up into tenths, I believe that is. So tenths of a second, all the way up to whatever timeline you need. So right now I have a 4-second file. I can cut that down to tenths of a second up to whatever the length I want it to be. Now this is one you can stack. So if I was to hit plus, I can add another one, and then another one, and another one. I can also add another one to layer behind or over top of this initial layer, and that's where the timeline, very much if you're used to editing videos or things like that, it is very similar layout to that, where you're just going to bring in these animators that will create your show mode by stacking and putting things in front and behind of other animations. As well as timing. You know, you want it to play through this one and then go to this one and then go to that one. With the Blue Ghost controller, you are able to select multiple show modes and hit start, and it will cycle through those show modes that you chose. As of right now, I don't believe this has that feature in the app or direct. So this would be a way to stack show modes if you wanted to. If you had a July 4th one, you could go in there real quick to start that up. Christmas, you know, whatever holiday or something like that, sports theme, something like that. You could go in, you could create a mode stacking multiple things, and then it's just there ready for you to queue up anytime you want. Whereas with Blue Ghost, it's more like you might have to name them selectively and go in the show modes and say, okay, this is my July 4th 1, July 4th 2, July 4th 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then you have to select them all manually and then hit play, and then it starts going. So it's a different approach to it. This could be a little bit quicker, but a little bit less customizable on the fly. If you're at a car show, you got what you got. There's probably not a whole lot you're going to change up at a show. But it'll also get you up and running a lot faster versus what you will with the Blue Ghost at a show. So pros and cons in that sense. Now, when you select one of these animators that we've added in, you'll notice that on the side it will pop up animator properties. That is where we're going to choose the preset animators that are inside of the controller, and there are quite a few here. I'm going to go through them as best I can, as best I understand them at this point. I've talked to the guys at Glowcraft a good bit, and there's been a lot of information flying back and forth. And I'll be honest with you, this controller is just there's so much to it that I definitely don't have a full grasp of the controller. But I'm going to work with you guys through it and show you as much as I do understand about these different animators. So, first up, you have your audio brightness. Audio brightness is tied in with the microphone input on the controller. Once again, that is one wire. There's no actual microphone input on the controller itself, but rather a wire that you run to the audio line out system on your car or whatever device that you're using to input audio to the controller. So you would just use that to activate this one, and this one is set to where it can be kind of like a top layer. So if you have a whole bunch of stuff going on down in these bottom layers, you would put this over top and it will brighten and dim out based on music input. So it's a good way to make it react to that audio input. So you do have a setting for the max brightness, the minimum brightness, so you can set a range so it's not like full on, full off. It can be kind of whatever you need it to be. And that one is, once again, probably ideal for more of a overlay than something that you would put by itself. Up next is Banner. Now, Banner is going to play in with your bitmaps, and I'm going to go into more detail in another video on bitmaps. But the idea with the bitmap creator is that you can create your own shapes for use within the animators and show modes. So you would be able to go in there, create a grid, whatever size you want it to be, and then fill out, almost like a light bright system, the design that you want it to be. And then there will be different animators like Banner where you will have the option to use those bitmaps that you created in a show mode. So you'll see under bitmap you have internal and user. User would be ones created by you. Internal are ones that are preset on the controller. Currently the internal options are X, smile, and heart. I'm sure there'll be more added in the future, but once again, you can always create your own by going to the bitmaps tab. And once again, we'll cover that in more detail in another video. You can choose your color. Now this is where you can choose a static color, which can be anything you want from the color selector tool there, or you can choose a standard palette. Now palettes can be any of the preset palettes, or you can create your own palettes under the palettes tab within this application. So the idea would be, if once again any kind of holidays that might be going on that have certain main color themes, football teams, basketball, whatever sports teams that you might prefer, you could create that color combination in there, and then you can use that within different animators on a show mode to highlight those colors and, you know, really stand out in different events and different things where certain color combinations might be more prevalent. And you can set the cycle speed. That just determines how fast it rotates between the different colors. And then you have your alignment. That just determines where you want to have it placed within your grid. You can have it offset to the right, the left, the top, the bottom, centered up. And then you also have the option to rotate. So rotate will be a really good option if you're trying to create a design that spins. A really good example would be that, like Schernigan or something like that, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, sorry, not a big Naruto guy. But if you wanted to create that design, you could put that in there and you could select rotate, and then you could adjust the rotation speed. And so basically you would just create one bitmap of that file design and load it up, hit rotate, choose the speed, and it would just automatically rotate that bitmap design that you created to create that effect that, you know, a lot of people are really fond of. So once you've selected something, you go ahead and hit save and then hit preview, and it will play a preview on your panel for you to see what it'll look like. Up next is bitmap stack. Now this one, like the name suggests, it is another bitmap animator, so you can use your bitmaps or any pre-built bitmaps to populate on this animator. You do have your color palette once again with the same features. You have the option to unstack, to fit to panel, centered, and your fill direction. So quite a few different options as to how it flows in or flows out, or the sizing. Pretty good amount of options there. Here is an idea of what that might look like. Up next is blur. This is another one that you would put as a top layer over top of other layers, and that way it will actually just affect the visual appearance of that layer. And in this case, it just blurs it a little bit, and you can adjust the amount of blur when it starts to blur and things like that to just create, you know, special effects if you're looking for that. Here's a brightness option, and this one would be where if you want something to be a little bit less than a full brightness. So probably a good example would be your running lights or something like that. So running lights on like a tail light, if you were building one, you don't want them to be at full bright, so you can actually set this slider to like 40% as an overlay, and that way when the brakes kick on, they go to 100%, and that way you get full bright out of them. So things like that. If there's a reason that you would want to dim a layer, this is the way that you would go about that. DVD is another option for bitmaps. So for this one, you can set speed, rotation speed, your bitmap, color palettes, your count, so how many of them do you want on there. And I'll give you an example here. So let's bump that up to like 4. We'll leave the scale as is, and we'll do a little demo of it. So you can see it kind of just takes whatever that bitmap shape is that you have and then populates it across the panel, spinning and just kind of moving around, flowing around. So that was a pretty good like stacker if you wanted to have something behind it, and you could maybe dim the panel behind it and then make those pop a little bit, and that way, you know, it kind of creates a little bit of a movement of unique style on top of whatever animators you've chosen within that frame. So this is a fade option. So fade basically just means instead of going full bright, half bright, you know, adjusting that level with the brightness slider, you can have it fade into it. So if you have your, once again, your startup animation, maybe you want your startup animation to be full bright, and then when the startup animation completes, you want it to fade to a 40%. Instead of just going full bright to 40%, you can have it fade in between so that it seems a little bit more uniform in how it's set up. So that would just be another little layer add that you would put over top of whatever animators you've chosen for the lower layers, and that would just affect the rate at which it drops to that 40%. Up next is fill. Now for fill, this is kind of where like it starts at one side and then fills out to the other side. There are a few different little options here. You could do unfill where it goes in reverse, and basically instead of filling it, it starts full and then it empties out. You can go to left to right. You can change your color palettes. I'm not really sure what easing function is, but for the most part, you get an idea of what that does, and you can adjust speed, things like that. Here is a little demo of that. Up next is fire. Now this is one of the actual animators in here. Probably would be your base for a different show mode that you might be creating. And this one does have a pretty cool effect, especially on a high density panel. And you can set flame density, you can set your color palette once again, but then in your preview you can see there it does have a pretty cool effect. It does look like a little bit of a flame going on. And obviously the color of those flames is going to be affected by the palette that you choose and the colors that you choose within this mode. Fight is another one that would be a really good option for your base animator. As you can see, it's almost like a three-dimensional swirling ball of sorts. It's kind of interesting the way that they just kind of flow uniformly around the screen. So that one might maybe you'd put that over top of like a full panel animator to try to create some kind of a design or something, but you have the same idea as the count, so how many of them you want to have. Right now we have 12, and then your color palettes that you can choose what colors you want them all to be. Up next is flow. Now for flow, you have once again your color palette that you can choose, and then you have your friction. Now the friction is basically just how fast it goes, so you adjust that to adjust the speed of the flow, But here's an example of that. Up next is glowworms. Glowworms is pretty interesting. You've got a base color, and then you've got your start and end color, and it just kind of flows across the screen. And you can set a few different things, you know, direction left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. You can set your speed, you can set the size, how many pixels long is that little worm, your gap size between the worms, as well as your head color, which once again that will be at the beginning and end of that worm, what color that is, as well as your tail color. You can set those. So here is a sample of that. Up next is Marquee. This is another bitmap animator. So you take your bitmaps and you load them up in here. Now this is one that I would use for like a sequential turn signal. So if you were having a turn signal with maybe an arrow or a shape or something like that to indicate the flow towards the outside, the marquee would be what you would want for that. You can set your speed at which rate it goes. You can choose your bitmap internal or user created. You can set your color, and you can set the direction left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to the top. You can have it start off the screen, end off the screen, or it can start on the screen and go to the end of the screen, whichever you're choosing for. And there is an example of what it will do. It just basically flows in whatever direction you've determined to indicate turn signals potentially, or maybe some other purpose that you might have for it. And here is a Pong animator as well. So obviously we all know what Pong is. Basic idea, you can adjust the speed, you can adjust the border, the color, the tail length, just kind of how fast everything goes. A little bit of ways to tweak different sides, but here is an example going pretty fast. You could probably slow it down a good bit, but that would be your Pong animator. Power supply switch. So this would be a case where maybe you have a reason to, maybe you have an external light on the car that's not addressable, but you want to control it within this app. You could control it using one of the 5-volt outputs on this. Now, keep in mind, most stuff is 12 volts, so you would have to make sure that you have some kind of a relay system that's activated with this trigger, but you might have another purpose for it as well. So basically it will activate the relay at certain points within a show mode. So if you wanted to strobe a light, you could theoretically do it using this and that output animator, or maybe there's some other purpose that you could do, but think of it kind of like the Blue Ghost and those switches. This is kind of similar to that, but you can actually have it queued up within a timeline on your animator here. So you can actually set that timeline, you start the show mode, and then it can activate and deactivate those power switches at certain points within this timeline. Up next is Pulse. Now, Pulse is got a few different options here. You got left to right, so you know whatever direction, left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. Then you get your length, so how long it flows, and your palettes that you can choose from. And this just kind of puts a little bit like of a like an EKG looking thing on there, kind of just bouncing up and down, a little bit of like an electrical pulse, I guess. Up next is Rain. Now this one I kind of like it. It's almost got like a Matrix vibe to it if you change the color to like green or something. You can set your speed, your density, your direction, your color palette, your tail length, quite a few different options there. But I think it's got a pretty cool, if you picture the old Matrix and the thing flowing around there, it's kind of like that, but it's meant to simulate rain, so you could also put that as a layer over top of another animator to kind of simulate that. Now here's another big animator that you would more than likely have as your base layer and put other stuff on top. This one, there's not a whole lot of settings to it. You have mirror horizontally and vertically, and one of the reasons for that, let's say that if you got a set of tail lights, you got your left light and your right light, and you've built them out, well they're mirrored basically in the way that you build them. So you would want this animation to flow in a mirrored function. so that way it's not doing the exact same thing on each side of the car. Instead, it's kind of flowing outward and it feels more uniform. So you would, once again, use this on your panels, and maybe you would create this on panel 1 for driver side light, and then you would also create it on panel 2 for your passenger side light, but you would flip that horizontally so that it flows uniformly outward. But here's a sample of that. Up next is Runner. Now, Runner is similar to Glowworms, but without that tail and that starter. So basic settings: speed, your size, your gap size, your direction, your color palette. But here's a demo of that. Up next is Shine. Now, one of the things that has really made the addressable RGB taillights with the 5mm panels pick up and take off is that galaxy flow animation that you see on a lot of the taillights that are built, especially by stop motion, people like that. And this animator is what's going to create that. Now you can change your speed, your color palettes, your shine direction, which way it starts and flows, your starts, off screen, on screen, shine size, density, and then that easing function again. But here's an example of that. And once again, you can layer this stuff. So if you had you wanted to combine that with some other animator, that might look pretty cool depending on how you did that. But that would be your base point for that galaxy style tails that everybody sees. Up next is Snakes. For this one, you have your default speed adjuster, you have your head color, your body color, your palette, your tail color, your direction, and head length, body length, tail length, and gap size. This one's a lot like Glowworms, but instead of taking up the entire panel, it just takes up sections. And once again, this is going really fast because I've just default settings. I'm not going to tweak anything, but you can imagine you could slow that down. You can space them out a little bit more. You can adjust that to fit whatever you're trying to do. It doesn't have to go top to bottom. It can go left to right. It can, whatever you're trying to do with that. And now you have Solid. Now, Solid, it is what it is. You choose a color, you set it, it goes solid on that color across the whole panel. So this would be ideal for things like your DRLs, your brakes, anything that you're going to want to eventually go to a solid color. You can have an animator before, and you might put this one at the end, so it won't be on a loop. After the animator plays through, it'll stop on that final panel, which would be a solid color, and you can set it to whatever color you ended up wanting. So DRLs in the front, you might have white, and your parking lights in the rear, you might have it do it at like a red. And like I said, just go solid color, whatever color you've chosen. And you can choose your palettes if you want it to alternate between colors. But once again, you can always just choose a solid color, any one color that you want. Up next is Sparkle. For Sparkle, you do have the same color palette options, and then you have your density, which is just choose how many LEDs are sparkling at one time within that panel. But here's an example of that one. Another good one to probably layer on top of some other design or some other shape. Up next is Spawn Dots. Now this one is kind of similar to Sparkle, but a little bit more user definable for what you want to do. You get your density, your duration, keep duration, diameter, fade, your spawn color, and your keep color. So you can actually have like 2 colors within that animation. Here is an example. Up next is Stack. Now Stack, you're probably familiar with. Most addressable controllers have this style show mode, and with this one you can choose your colors, you can choose to stack or unstack, so it plays forward or it plays in reverse. You can choose the brick size as to how large each stack is, and you can choose your fill direction, which direction it goes. Up next is strobe. First thing in my mind, the first case where I used this was the brakes. So a lot of people like to just get that attention with that strobing action when you first hit the brake pedal. So this would be a great layer over top of a solid. So if you took a solid red and you put this over top, it will strobe that red to get people's attention when you're trying to stop. So for that, you have your on brightness, your off brightness, and your frequency, and you can basically just determine how extreme the strobe is. Do you go full on, full off, or do you want it to just kind of dim on, dim on, dim on, dim on? And you can, adjust that to whatever your parameters are. So once again, this is an overlay, so it would be something you would put on top of another animator. Up next is swirl. So this one, you got your basic settings for your color. But beyond that, that is an idea of what that looks like. Another good one to maybe layer on top of a larger show mode, depending on what your goals are. Up next is trippy. For trippy, you do have your speed, your scale, and you can mirror this one as well. This one's a lot like the RGB hypnotic. But they are different. If you look at them side by side, they do actually animate just a little bit differently. Up next is VU. Now this is another one that's going to play with the microphone input on the controller. So if you tie that into your audio system, it will actually put up a visualizer for audio visualizer on the screen, and you can adjust some different parameters of that, your bar size, your fill direction, your color, your palette, and you can make that animator dance to whatever music inputs that you're doing. So next up is wipe. And for wipe, you have your speed, your color palette, your wipe direction. You can start on screen, end off screen, head length, fade head, tail length, fade to tail, easing function, whole bunch of different options there. As the title says, basically it starts at one side and it flows to the other side. And there's a few different adjustments that you can make to how it does it and how it appears on your taillight itself. But that's the basic function. This could be a little bit more of a simplified turn signal if you don't want to use bitmaps. That would be a pretty good one to use. So to give you guys a little bit of an example of stacking these animators, I created a little quick mode here, a little 4-second play, and I've got a strobe, a DVD, and a trippy all layered out. And this will give you an idea of what that might look like. And once again, the things that you can stack and the way that you stack them is going to greatly affect the show mode and what it looks like. And so, there's a lot of different options. That's just one that I threw together really quick to give you guys an idea. And, pretty cool way to make something really unique, stacking these different modes to create something really unique from anything else. In the event that you do create, let's say in the case here, I created another null and I decide I don't want that, I want to remove it. It's just as simple as selecting it and hitting the X under animator properties, and that will actually remove that animator from the timeline. So that's it. Once you have designed a show mode and you're happy with what you have, you go ahead, make sure everything is named, make sure you got priority set, make sure you got your trigger set, demoable if you do want it available on the app, and then hit save. And that will save it to your show mode screen. Then you can go in here, you can add another show mode, and just create a whole list of different show modes. Once again, once you create show modes, you can go into your settings, you can download those show modes to your laptop or tablet, whatever device you're using, and that way you can use them on multiple lights or multiple devices. So that way, you go through all this trouble to create an animator, it doesn't have to go with that light and you have to create it manually every single time. You can use that, you could share it with other people if you want, or you can keep it for your own builds and make it load up to different devices that you're using. So I hope you found that video helpful. Hope you guys are as excited about this controller as I am to try to dive in, get a little bit further with it, have some more fun with it. They are available on the website right now. Today is the 8th of November, and I do not have my inventory in yet, but I should have it very soon. It's on the way right now. And so they will be shipping out right away, but they are available on the website right now. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. And as always, check out nextlevelneo.com for all your LED lighting needs. Thanks.